The mildest touch of consciousness slowly crept across my mind. Not yet mindful of almost anything, the low hum of discussion under sterile fluorescent lights was the first thing I was able to identify. Their words amounted to nothing more than a drawn-on string of gibberish. Not that their faint muttering would allow speech to reach my ears either way. I was still mostly in a dark void, barely aware of even that much. The world was happening around me as I was absolutely nowhere. I soaked up the whispers as disorientation slowly began to dissipate. Gradually, thoughts began to construct themselves in a way that only eventually came to be rational. How am I here? I scarcely managed to think to myself. I would say I was asleep, but that wouldn't have been right. Even when you're asleep, even though you're not conscious, you always have some sense that you're asleep. There's some sense of a passage of time, a sense that you're living. But I felt I was awaking out of nothingness. No stream of consciousness or memories. There was nothing until this moment. Not even a sense of darkness or that I even existed. There was just nothing there. I felt I had been dead. Was I dead? Was I dying? These thoughts didn't plague me too heavily. I don't think anything could have in that moment. I was still engulfed by the void that I seemed to be stepping out of. Reality took its time coming back to me. Relevant memories began to grace my mind, swirling in a haze and evading my focus before actualizing in the center, allowing me to visit them. Surgery. I had surgery. I arrived at, the thought taking up much more energy than it should have. Still, this realization put me slightly at ease when it finally came. The next thing I noticed outside of myself was something in my mouth. It was something hard, placed between my teeth. I hadn't even noticed at first, but as the void that anesthesia had created for me fell away more and more, the more agitating this object became. I soon felt as though I were about to gag, so I began to wave my wrists with whatever strength I had in order to gain the attention of the surgeons. Or at least, that's what I tried to do. The compulsion automatically generated in my brain, but never made its way anywhere near my arm. As I became more conscious, though utterly exhausted, I resigned myself to the fact that the anesthesia was preventing me from moving at all. I wanted so badly to remove the object from my mouth. It kept pressing down on my tongue. I've never been good with tongue depressors, so it felt like torture to have this just sitting on my tongue. I even began to feel a little queasy about it. Consciousness was still making its way back to me. The droning mutters and whispers of the doctors came to transform themselves into English. The words came upon my ears, but exhaustion pushed them back out. Only small slivers of key words were able to slip their way into my ears. The operator. Sterilized. Dr. Reynolds. Into prep. Scrubbing. My mind began to ponder on the situation, mostly trying to remember everything leading up to anesthesia. The pressure on my tongue was really bothering me. I tried, with whatever mental capacity I had at that point, not to think about it, despite the visceral reaction it evoked. I didn't pay much mind to what the surgeons were saying. It wasn't important. They were probably unaware I was awake yet, so it was all irrelevant. Except... Wait. Did they say prep? Prep for what? Was I being moved? Was there something else that they needed to do? Wound dressings? I wasn't sure. I thought it must have been something like that. They probably had to tie me down or something to get me to a new room. Disorientation at this point had retired to the recesses of my mind. Though still present, I could think and hear more clearly than I could moments before. Everything was still clouded and murky, but most of it was there. Still unable to do anything, the words of the surgeons automatically began to register with me, despite the lack of active listening on my part. In preparing the betadine. Betadine? Why? I didn't need betadine, unless it was to clean the incision. I didn't think betadine was used for that purpose, but what did I know? I wasn't a surgeon. Moments later, I felt something cold, wet, and spongy licking at my side. I hoped to be done with everything soon. I was growing impatient. I had no idea when I was going to come to. I was beginning to feel discomfort overtake me from localized areas, spreading outward until it completely overtook my body. Nausea whelmed my abdomen, exhaustion nagged at my arms, and that damn object in my mouth wasn't doing anything to help matters. I felt the slither and kneading of rubber gloves against my moistened skin. Each press felt like a dagger straight into my abdomen. Why were they pressing me? Why would they press my abdomen after I just had surgery there? They of all people should know how sensitive it is, right? That's when I heard one of the surgeons. She said something that absolutely made my blood run cold. Are we ready to begin the surgery? No, that wasn't right. I was finished with the surgery. I was coming out of anesthesia. I was done. They were done, right? This couldn't be. I must have misheard. That couldn't be right. One of them called for a scalpel. I felt gloves part their fingers to hold my skin taut. No! Stop! Please, stop! I tried my best to plead telepathically. Any unconsciousness and disorientation had been stamped out by terror and adrenaline. I tried anything to move. I attempted to jerk my body in the most violent way I could. Millions of neurons fired all at once to scream, beg, jolt, flail, anything my body would allow, and every signal evaporated before even making it to the brainstem. I couldn't so much as whimper in fear of what was to come. On my side, between the gloved fingers, arose a sharp, wrenching slice. It made its torturous journey across more skin than I even knew I had. Blood drained from my head, leaving me faint. Pain surged from the relentless incisions to all corners of my body. I had never felt a pain like this in my entire life. It was as though every pain I'd felt up until that point reconciled into an agonizing, gaping pit. I wanted to scream. My instinct was to scream. Yet I moved not a muscle. My brain was going crazy to try and make anything happen, to protest, to beg, to cry, anything. The drugs completely overpowered my brain's every attempt. They were going to allow me to suffer through everything. I don't know what was worse in that moment, the pain itself or the anticipation. I had already experienced anguish beyond anything I thought I would, but this was just the first step. The surgery would last hours, and I was only seconds in. Shock overtook me at the thought of this. I was quickly snapped out of it by a second incision through fascia and muscle. My abdomen bellowed in agony, begging for relief. I could feel desperation and helplessness exude from my every pore, entirely lost on the surgeons around me. My stomach contorted and writhed inside me, producing an ever-thickening veil of nausea. Every iota of my soul was sobbing uncontrollably in pain and fear as my body lay entirely still on the table. I just wanted to pass out so I wouldn't have to feel anything. I felt as though I may, yet a cruel, uncaring consciousness would not leave me be. Rubber fingers crept their way inside me, fondling and caressing my soft, supple insides, sending torturous shockwaves throughout my body. Thick, warm liquid spilled down my side before being mopped up by fibers. Cold, merciless metals began to join the fingers, and the dances of my organs were a seedy nightclub, handling them brutally without reservation. This cruel, excruciating palpation seemed to continue for eons. I felt I might die. Maybe. Part of me wanted to in those moments. Anything to end the sadistic ravage of the cavernous artificial gash that was my entire existence from now until who even knew when. If I couldn't fight, as I tried so hard to do, I just wanted to give up entirely. That was neither an option. Enduring this torment was I'd say my only option. But having an option would imply that I had any agency. It wasn't my only option. It was my fate. I wished for even a single tear to fall, as it may have healed the tiniest whit of pain or fear, and I couldn't even be granted that much. And the worst hadn't even begun. After the mindless mangling of my internal organs came the real surgery. The offending organ had been located. Sharp metal unforgivingly began to pierce my innards. Electricity cut through my entire body like barbed wire. My brain flooded with abortive messages to wail in agony and recoil. All that existed in that moment was pain. There was nothing else. I could no longer think about the situation. I could no longer attempt to protest. I could no longer attempt to wish I was asleep. I could no longer hope for death. All I had any ability to do anymore was receive pain. I wasn't in pain. My entire body was pain. My entire existence was suffering. Every grope, every clamp, every slice I felt enraged my entire body. It was as though each cut existed not only in my abdomen, but in every inch of my body. I scarcely remember some pokes sending jolts out everywhere, followed by a pulling sensation. At this point, finally, shock and exhaustion from the entire ordeal was humane enough to relieve me of my consciousness once again. I awoke yet again in a state where I was just barely aware of anything. Again, waking out of nothingness. This time I was greeted by my own self vomiting. I was hardly aware I was even doing it, but I think that's the only thing I truly was aware of. I think it's only because I could feel the acid rising in my throat. I only breached consciousness again to vomit for a few times, and then slowly I began to regain my bearings. I was still unable to open my eyes, but this time, at least I could move. As I gained consciousness, what I first noticed was my incision site. All at once it throbbed in agony, building upon itself faster and faster until I was no better than I was in the middle of the operation. I couldn't handle it anymore, and I let out the loudest cry I ever had in my life. I thought my lungs might burst, and I couldn't hear anything outside of the sound of my own voice. It might seem strange, but there's some part of me that was all too glad to. You never realize how much built-in coping mechanisms alleviate pain until you're in a situation where you're robbed of them. I could scarcely sense the presence of someone by my bedside as I howled furiously. I could slowly notice the pain leave my body, and in turn, my wailing quelled to a moan, then to a simper, and then finally into silence. And then it was over. It was finally all over. I was entirely stupefied at this realization. What felt like a lifetime of anguish and suffering was finally over. Though I still couldn't open my eyes, I could feel hot pearls leave the corner of my eyes and travel down my cheeks before losing themselves in my hairline. I was exhausted, though I trembled in relief. Something seemed slightly off, though. I almost didn't notice because I was still pretty out of it, but the normal bustle of the hospital wasn't there. Maybe I was in a private room, but I thought I might hear my wife's voice or hear her talking to the doctors or something. Maybe she had stepped out momentarily while waiting for me to awake. I could hear some steps on what sounded like a grainy, textured surface. Two people stood a distance from me, though I could feel their presence in my room. I could faintly hear them speak to one another. "How did the procedure go?" one of them asked. "Great," replied the other. "We have the kidney." Though I was still half unconscious, I was absolutely petrified at what he had said. I had gone in for an appendectomy. Determination compelled me to open my eyes to question the surgeons. Shapes merged together in a blur behind sticky tears and drugs. Slowly, things came into focus. The first thing I noticed that was off was a round pillar with a number on it. It wasn't drywall, it was concrete. More details appeared all around me. I noticed the grimy grout and stained tiles on the walls. The floor was a light yet cracked concrete, and the door ahead of me was a gray metal shutter door that opened from the bottom. And that's when I realized it. I wasn't in a hospital.